Thanks for tuning in to the Pacey Performance Podcast. So this morning, I am delighted to welcome Kristian Thorborg. So welcome to the podcast, mate.
Thank you very much, Rob.
Thank you very much for coming on. Appreciate your time. I know it's a bit of a weird time at the minute. It's people working from home, working in the office. So I appreciate you giving up your time. But anyone that doesn't know who you are, just want to give us a bit of an intro into you, what you're doing currently, and what you've done previously education-wise and whatnot.
Yeah, so currently I'm a professor at Copenhagen University in orthopedics, actually, of all things. But my background is I'm a sports physiotherapist, and I trained from Copenhagen and graduated in 1998, so more than 20 years ago. And then I worked for 10 years as a clinician, as a sports physiotherapist. During that time, I did my master's in sports physiotherapy in Melbourne, actually. You can't do that from Denmark. You can't specialize in that way. So I had to go somewhere else and went to Melbourne, which was a very, very good experience. As I said, probably the first 10 years was mostly clinical and mostly from a clinic. I haven't worked much with teams. I have a background as playing football or soccer myself. And I was getting a bit tired of sort of using all my weekends. So when I finally stopped my half lousy career, I decided that I was gonna spend the weekend with the family instead. So mainly from a clinical setting and also a clinical point of view. And then sort of when I become more and more sort of specialized, I also had more and more questions. And at some point, I was challenged a little bit by the professor where I work, Per Hölmich, to come and try to do some research with him. And that set off my PhD, which is in the area of hip and groin problems, but this was more related to groin problems. But my other interest was hamstring injuries, and that was another focus we had at the research unit where I currently work, which is the Sports Orthopedic Research Center in Copenhagen, where I'm the research lead, and the head of the department is Per Hölmich, that some of you might know as well, professor also from Copenhagen University. And that's where I still am. I still work a little bit also clinically, both at the department, but also in private practice still, trying to keep up my clinical skills, probably in sort of 1 day a week at the moment, or 2 half days. And I actually now, it becomes more specialized. So it's more and more hip and groin and actually hamstring injuries that I see.
Were you any good at football or not? You said half. No good.
I was playing sort of just below professional level. So I was getting paid, but not enough that you could live on it. So I had to find a different career path at some point. Yeah. So and if you compare that level probably to Premier League or an English level, I would say that's a lot lower down as well. So, but I was enjoying it, and like many other kids growing up, I wanted to become a professional and play with the national team, and I wasn't that good.
Of course. What position did you play?
So I played almost all the positions except goalkeeper.
Moved around, okay.
Yeah, but sort of ended up at defensive midfield.
Okay. Who would be that? Eriksson now?
Probably. So it's number 6 right now. So it's sort of your holding midfield. No, he would probably be an 8. I would guess.
Be an 8, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So who would it compare to? It's usually also the oldest midfielder.
Who can't run.
So it probably exactly. It'd probably be Eriksson in a few years, maybe.
Yes. Okay. Nice. Brilliant. So when did you get in touch with and get to work with the guys in Australia, the hamstring group in Australia?
Yeah. So that's basically, I think, I met David Opar and Anthony Shield at a conference, and basically I was actually sitting in on their session. I think it was a football medicine conference in London, and I think this, in many ways, I usually tell this story because I looked in the abstract book and I could see some really interesting abstracts on hamstring injuries, and this was work in relation to the Nordic board, but also in relation to some of the strength work and the muscle work they've done in relation to cross-sectional area and also in relation to when you load up the hamstrings, and if you're injured, how do the hamstrings activate during an exercise. And so I was looking at this program, and I said to Per Hølmik, my colleague, I think we should go and see this one. That looks pretty interesting. And we come into this session, and you know, football medicine is a huge venue. There's, I think, more than 2,000 or 3,000 people there, at least now there is. And we come into this session, and there's like 10 people in the room, and and it was an excellent session. Matt Bourne was presenting, David was presenting, maybe also Ryan Timmons was presenting, did an awesome job. And you sit there and you think this is quite novel, and then you look to the right, and of these 10 people, Professor Roald Barr has snuck in as well. Okay. So again, I think just some instinct tells you, you look at, when you're researching, you look for the abstracts, what's good, what's new, and basically we were all there. And I think we both groups approached them, and I think both groups has gained an enormous, not just knowledge, but also I've been lucky enough to work together with these people, and it definitely has helped my understanding of what we're doing and trying to achieve. I think what was the gap was, I've always said that because we did the Nordic hamstring study, a big RCT many years ago now, that came out in 2011, and I, at that point, I remember talking to especially the physiologists and biomechanists, and I said, if just somebody would go in and try to understand the underpinning mechanism of why this works, because we really don't know, and it's actually a little bit counterintuitive why it works. And then I think basically that's a lot what they did, and they came in and I think if not for them, I think they've made it hugely popular again to have a different look at this, because I think, and I know for a fact that a lot of people have already sort of like in 2012, 13, almost buried the idea, even though our RCT showed that this was very, very effective on preventing hamstring injuries.
So why was that, Kristian? Why was that written off?
It's I think that's difficult for me to say, but I think, again, I just think that this exercise was so counterintuitive in relation to, if your mindset is that it has to be functional, and exercises have to be functional and very specific to what you're trying to achieve on the pitch, this is anything but that. When you look at it at face value, I think people struggle with that, and I struggle with that. So I completely understand that. I mean, what changed my mind was when I saw the data, and the data just kept very constantly coming in, showing the same result. So I mean, I understand the point of view. I think I don't understand that if you believe in science, I don't understand that you have to, that you're completely fixed on that point of view. I think that's probably the main issue for me.
Mm-hmm. One thing that came up with the chats with Josh Ruddy, Ryan, and Jack Hickey when I had them guys on, obviously all part of the same group, looking at very similar things, and their concern of almost stating early on, yes, we do research in this area, but this isn't the only thing we believe in. Like, it's just our research area. And I know we spoke before I hit record about a similar thing, and it's just not been pigeonholed, I guess. And this isn't, although this is a research area of mine, I don't just believe in this and nothing else, which when you go on social media, people love to go, I'm this guy or I'm this guy. Whereas in actual fact, it's everything. It's one of many things. I just wanted to put that over to you and see about your concern of being labelled as a Nordic guy versus a non-Nordic guy, when that's just not the case.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like, I don't think we will ever get rid of that. I think the world is probably much easier when you put it in black and white like that. But I think we've been misunderstood a lot. I think one of the reasons I'm on Twitter and I'll defend the Nordic hamstring at the moment, and will keep posting on Twitter on it, is mainly to try to provide balance. It's not that I'm not trying to persuade those people who don't believe in it, but it is for me to try and provide balance for the listening audience out there, and so that, and of course, because I keep providing probably the same point of view, that can be looked upon as a little bit as a stubborn point of view as well. But I think it is important, and I think when one of the first times I realized that we did have a problem was when I was asked to be a reviewer for a sort of a position piece, and it was on hamstring injury selection. And what blew my mind was that the only exercise, there was probably 10 or 12 different exercises suggested, and the only exercise not in there, would you believe, of any hamstring exercise for prevention of hamstring injuries was the Nordic hamstring exercise. And I actually got hold of the editor saying this is a huge problem. I mean, how can we? I mean, it's probably one of the best documented exercises, one-off exercises to prevent any injury. So if this is not making its way through to the people trying to prevent injuries, I think there's a huge problem.
Why do you think that it has become so polarized? Do you think, and I'll just put something to you, Kristian, do you think people have an issue that the Nord board has come out of this as a commercial?
So I think if you haven't followed the literature, I think some started following it when the Nord board came out, and then some, of course, you would think that these two are very closely linked. But I think that was the awesome part as well, was that this was just an idea by David and Anthony related to, I think, our research, but we had no communication. As I said, I've never heard about these guys before I met them in London at this conference. So for me, that was very innovative and a very good way to try and sort of just bring the research further. I think there's one thing I would like to mention, which is usually very misunderstood when you look at our study, which was a big RCT on almost 1,000 football players from Denmark, soccer players, and which was randomized into two groups. And what we actually looked was that we had a control group who would do their usual football training management, whatever you do in a football club, from the highest level to sort of that level I played, so just below. And then the intervention group was the Nordic hamstring protocol, which had been shown from other groups to be very effective on increasing eccentric strength in the knee flexors. And there was a study before us that was not, it was sort of a quasi-randomized, it was not a real randomized study, where they looked at data from two different countries where they had a really dramatic effect. So at this point, we just have something that looks really effective, but we don't know how it's working. So our study was sort of trying to, can we actually confirm this finding? So ours was a confirmatory study trying to do it in a more rigorous RCT setting. So what a lot of people don't realize is that they would often criticize, but this is just one exercise. How could it ever be effective? Because we do at least 1, 2, 3, or 4 different things. What this study was actually showing was that if you play regular football in a setting, including your strength and conditioning, including all the football training you do, if you then on top of that add the Nordic hamstring exercise protocol, and you compare it with not adding it, then you have something that is very, very simple. It takes very, very little time. Actually starts off the first week by 2 times 5 repetitions. That's all you do the first week. That is very, very effective. So when you say that it's just one exercise, you're completely forgetting the whole design of the study, which means that these players are full on playing and training football. And then you just add something a little extra, which is probably a lot extra in terms of the exercise stimuli, but in compared to time-wise and compared to other things that you would like to do with all these football players, it's really nothing at all. And I think that is one point that I think people keep forgetting when they say, oh, but how can one exercise work? because they're true. If this was just one exercise and we told one club, this intervention group, now you can't play football, you can only do this exercise. I mean, first of all, it wouldn't be feasible, you wouldn't be able to do it, but it probably wouldn't work as well. Like it's not, I mean, that's what's happening with the lockdown. Asking people not to play football is certainly doing nothing good for hamstring injuries, of course, because you have no physiological stimuli in relation to sprinting, and that's detrimental to these injuries. So I think that for me, that's a very important point that is usually often forgotten, I think.
Mm-hmm. So we've got all this data, we've got all this research from you guys and Dave and Anthony's groups. Why is there still people arguing against the use of Nordics when, if you like you say, we're all, whether you're a strength and conditioning coach or a sports scientist, they're all under the sports scientist banner. So people are scientists and the science says that it worked. Why are people still questioning its implementation?
So I think what we have to take very seriously is, of course, that there might be an implementation problem.
Okay.
And definitely there are barriers towards implementing this. I think we haven't done enough research or enough sort of surveying what the barriers are. We've done a little bit, and we were actually able to do this at the Champions League level, where we were sort of asking Champions League clubs whether they were actually doing the Nordic hamstring protocol, and there you could definitely see that they were definitely not using it per protocol, so they were not using the entire 10 weeks. So you could argue that. So I think there was it was around 10 or 11% of the clubs that would say they were using the full protocol. But there were also clubs not using the exercise at all. So I mean, there would be some opinions out there saying this is probably a bad exercise entirely. And then there would be clubs, and with our survey, we couldn't say exactly how they would then utilize it. But what we hear, and when we speak to different clubs, different levels, is that they are, of course, probably trying to modify it in some way that it fits their world better. And this is probably, or this not probably, this is where we need, I think, to do more research, because if people say, I'm just going to change the evidence or what actually shows to be effective according to the evidence, and we're not testing whether that's actually working, then I think we still have a problem. We might change it to something that's not working anymore. And this is also, I think, where some of the work done in Australia is very interesting, because they've sort of gone a little bit into dosage. Can we change the actual content and dosage of the program so we don't have to do a full 10-week program? So I think some, especially at the highest level, will say, 10 weeks, that's not possible to fit in anywhere. I'm not completely convinced about the argument. I think one of the problems with that is that if you've never done it and then you have to start with 10 weeks somewhere, I think it's a problem. But I've seen clubs where they also at the highest level, where they slowly over time are actually able to build up this kind of work and put it into their normal strength and conditioning work. And then, of course, they have to periodize this also in relation to the season. And there's some evidence, also emerging evidence, that it looks like the more consistent you can actually be with this. So can you even do it during more than one season? It looks like it just gets better and better. So I think I would really love to see more clubs trying to be more intentional about trying to implement it in some way. It may still not be the full program, but and I will come back to this, I think there is some argument for having a large volume, and also why we were successful with this volume when we started. Mm-hmm. We can discuss that further.
Of course.
So one issue I think is so one of the risk factors we've seen, especially from the Australian group, is the fascicle length. So if you have shorter fascicle length, you're at increased risk of getting a hamstring injury. And that is what we call a surrogate measure. So that means it's actually not an easy measure to get, because it's very operator dependent, and not a lot of people do it well. It's from what I've heard. So that's one issue. But even it's a lot easier. It's an easier measure in the way that you can do your protocol, and then you can get a very quick assessment of how it actually affects your fascicles. So the challenge with that, or the problem with that, is that a risk factor or a surrogate measure does not correlate 100% to injury prevention. So you have to be very careful when you then change your practice based on a surrogate measure or on a risk factor. And this is also one of the reasons why risk factors are so poor at predicting individual sort of who will get injured, who will not get injured. So it's that they're sort of part of the bigger picture. They can explain some of the variance in risks that we see, but they're not going to predict what's going to happen. And in the same way, you can say that just because you change fascicle length doesn't mean you're actually getting the adaptation you need. We don't actually know whether that's enough to get a preventive effect.
What are the risk factors, Kristian, while we're on it?
So the most consistent risk factors would be age is one, and we can come back to that because it's very specific in hamstring injuries. You get old very quickly with hamstring injuries. You hit 22, 23 in football or in soccer, and then you're actually on the brink of increasing your risk because you're in the old group. And then the other big one, of course, is previous history of hamstring injury. And then I think eccentric strength is in there somewhere, and also in relation to quadricep strength. So there might be something about the ratio as well, but the evidence there is so mixed that it's very, very difficult to sort of say that eccentric strength alone, or even like that absolute parameter is a good predictor, or not even a predictor risk factor. It comes out in some studies and not in other studies. So again, from that point of view, you could say, so I don't think it's necessarily the point that you are the strongest one eccentrically in your group, but I think doing eccentric strength training would more or less always be a good idea for the whole group.
One thing that I found was, I think it was Ryan's paper, and there was, I think it might have been soccer. I can't think of it now, but gave a figure. I think it was 245 to 50 newtons, and below that, your risk of hamstring injury significantly increased. And I know, and this is one thing that I spoke with Josh and Ryan when they came on, was this kind of jumping on a threshold and going, okay, that's my number. Like anything above that, I'm good. Anything below that is not good, because in Ryan's population, that's what was found. I guess that can be an issue when people see something in a paper and just go, boom, I'm going to use that and I'm going to run with it. Is that something that you have found as well, that people are looking for that kind of golden number?
No, for sure. And you can understand that reasoning. I mean, and especially this is, I think, where risk factor papers are a little bit, can be a little bit risky to follow because I mean, this first of all, you had to have all this variance within your group of players, but second of all, this is something you can change really, really quickly. And that's, so both fascicle length and eccentric strength, I think, I mean, within 2 or 3 weeks, you can actually change that. And that would be really awesome if I could also change the risk of getting a hamstring injury in 2 to 3 weeks. And this is probably where I'm more skeptical, and where our work, there's not a lot of data here, so this is also, and I'm driving an opinion now, but based on our work and when you look into our data, you can see that, so for the first 10 weeks when they do the actual protocol, we have, if I remember correctly, we have 9 and 12 injuries in the two groups. And if I remember correctly, I think we have 12 injuries in the intervention group. So, and after the 10-week period, so for the rest of the season, actually, we only see 3 more injuries in the intervention group. So there is some kind of adaptation going on through the first 10 weeks. Unfortunately, we don't have data. We didn't put down the date, so we don't know whether it happened in the first 3 or 4 weeks, or my guess is it was spread out in those 10 weeks. But what is really interesting is that when the adaptation kicks in, it looks like it's a very, very effective vaccine that you've exposed your hamstrings to. And this is also where I think that even going back to some of the old ideas on giving eccentric work to your hamstring was also very much based on, this is Brockett's work back in 2000, early 2000. They were very much looking on giving 1 bout of eccentric exercise, and we know that that's unaccustomed exercise that makes you very sore. But the idea that also shifts the curve a little bit and makes you on the descending limb, makes you eccentrically stronger straight away, I think I have difficulties with grasping that as the effective part of the program. And the same with fascicle length, especially when you see that you can actually, which is I think quite consistent, it seems that you can change this in 2 weeks. So I've asked some of our physiologists here in Copenhagen and in Denmark, what do you think, is that a real physiological response? And I think no one knows at the moment. Just, I mean, Per Agard, which is a very good physiologist as well, saying that it could also be that you're basically stretching the fascicles with this kind of approach, and they're maybe sort of aligning them a little bit, or I mean, but this is something we don't know. And again, I'm not saying it's not useful, but again, maybe that's not enough. Maybe we need more than that. So, and if probably, so the next question should probably be, what is that? What is it that we need? I think that we need some of the things, the adaptations we see with strength training. I think there is a structural component of this, which is very important. So I think maybe changing cross-sectional area could be important. I definitely think fascicle length does play a role, but we know that the injury occurs at the muscular-tendinous junction, and we also know that this is huge forces, huge stress occur in this area, and it would make a lot of sense that if exercising over a longer time it takes longer time to address the myotendinous junction because it's made out of collagen. So that I think that's probably important, and we have some work coming out of Copenhagen on that, where it seems that you have a collagen response as well. But this is very, very early days, and it's very difficult to say whether that's actually particular at the junction and where the injury occurs. But I would imagine that you need a structural adaptation going beyond just fascicle length. That would be my guess anyway.
Where do you stand on asymmetries? Because again, it's a number. It's something that's easily relatable. And people may jump on it.
Yeah. So asymmetries and probably also ratios have this inherent problems with measurement error, because now you're actually using 2 measures and combining them. So usually you get much more measurement error. So it's a much more difficult measure to use, and also usually you just get a lot more variance. It's not irrelevant. There's some good study also showing on people running, sprinting, that there could be asymmetries, and asymmetries can be a problem. So I think, and especially probably in a task or in something like sprinting, I think, which should be quite symmetrical. It's probably not 100% symmetrical, but it probably should have equal contributions from both legs. I think it could be relevant. Whether you can measure that in a strength device like the Nordic or even isokinetically, that's probably where I'm more skeptical. And in the Nordic, I think it's even more problematic, because you sort of you're if you have a weak leg, the weak leg would probably decide a little bit how far you go. It's very difficult to sort of push very differently, I would argue, with one leg versus the other when you're testing. In some ways, are testing two legs at the same time.
Okay.
So I'm not a big on the Nordboard. I'm a much bigger fan on the absolute value, and also when you normalize that. And I think it's actually amazing that, because it has a lot of pitfalls as well, that I think it was really cool when they showed it the first time, that even without normalizing this, it actually showed up as quite a significant risk factor. So something very simple actually added quite a lot of value, in my opinion.
So why is it so important to take body weight into account when you're looking at the overall value?
Basically, you just have to be careful to I think, to compare pears and what do you call it, orange and apples? Or, yeah. So I think you have to be careful when. So one thing we would like to normalize is usually, of course, their body weight, or you can say muscle mass or whatever. So how strong are you per unit? And the other thing is also definitely lever on this one, because the length of your upper body and your legs might have a big influence, and that is not accounted for either. And there are some good studies, I think it's from Martin Bouchard, also showing that this can affect the measurements quite a lot. So definitely you have to be critical of that. We've normalized to body weight as well. We haven't, some of the studies we've seen, we see quite similar figures when we normalize and don't normalize. So I think it's still quite a good raw measure of somebody's ability to break essentially with the hamstrings.
Is there anything out there around limb length?
I'm not sure. I can't remember if Martin's group also looked at that. Probably worth checking out what they did. I can't remember, but they certainly had some valid points around that.
Okay. So for those in professional sport with fixtures and the congestion that we know is there, what would you recommend in terms of assessing risk for hamstring injuries? I know it may be just a conclusion of, or a summary of what we've just said, but and in terms of implementing that into maybe one of the clubs that you tested initially, one of the football clubs, what would you recommend to them guys to get a bit of a better picture of risk of hamstring injury?
So I think the most simple approach, and again, it depends. If you know your squad, if you know your players, if you've been in the club for a long time, I think you know the profiles, not even of even of your squad, you know your profile, but also probably on individual level, because you know which players usually carry these problems. So they would always be at risk, and you really have to. I think you need extra arguments with them to go into eccentric strengthening, and that can even be difficult as well. But I think that from a strength testing point of view, and even if you have a Nordboard in the club, I wouldn't rely on it I wouldn't rely on that number. I would focus much more on implementing what we know works in prevention, and then maybe use the Nordboard as a sort of a measure for also checking whether they're actually getting stronger, for motivating them, stuff like that. It's not the number that would dictate if I'm going to do prevention or not. I mean, on the Nordboard anyway. I mean, that's the general preventative effects that we've seen that would make me say I think we could implement something here that could affect the whole squad.
So has the number gone up? Have we got better, rather than what is the actual number?
So I'm not the right person to answer that. I think if you just look at the numbers, and if you look in the Champions League, you can see that there's been some argument that the numbers are not changing. So there's lots of arguments now if the numbers are changing or not. Again, it's a very difficult comparison, because the comparison goes back 20 years and the game has changed a lot. So I mean, speed and sprinting is and repetitive sprinting is more important than ever. So even you could argue that the load on the hamstrings is a lot bigger than it was even when I played. So I think it's not a fair comparison, but I think our studies and all studies that implement Nordic hamstring shows that it's effective. So this is why you have to be very careful on sort of also in your own club or at club level to say, because the numbers are the same, this is not effective. There's so many other factors that we're not controlling. And basically that's why we did the survey in the Champions League, because the argument came out from the Champions League data was that nothing has changed. Therefore, Nordics or whatever we do is not working. That's a very, very, I would say, dangerous conclusion, because you're not taking the environment or culture or whatever has changed in the game into account at all.
Did you ever have hamstring injuries as a player? I did, and I was labelled. You can't get a hamstring injury because you're not very fast. That was you've got to be fast to get a hamstring injury. That was the one that came back to me.
I would be in the same category. I got a really, really nasty one late in my career when I was slower than ever, and I was not a fast player either. But I think this is a good point, because, and I think that's the other point you need to address in your team. And you can always argue, why not just apply to the older players? But what I see and often see when I see players or they come or I do consultancies, it's very, very difficult if the culture was not there in the first place to do eccentric work or even do strength training. It's almost impossible to get a 28-year-old player to get into it. If he's never done it and he thinks he's been successful without it to this point, even with a hamstring injury, that could be mission impossible. So this is also why I think consistency is probably one of the most important things in your club. And I've seen clubs do this really, really well, where they have a plan, and it doesn't have to be necessarily the full Nordic protocol, but they do have something they do consistently year in, year out. And there's a very, very important educational aspect of that, is that players from a very young age, because you could also argue that the young players are not that much at risk, so why should they do it? But if they know from even 14, 15 years old, they get to know this kind of exercise, know that strength training is important, and it's part of their routine, it's part of the gym work they do. It's much, much easier to tweak that a little bit later on in their career, as is if they now have to sort of do something they've never done before. I've had numerous players who just say, I'm not doing strength training, and that's not almost part of who I am, and then it's mission impossible. So I think there's other reasons than just trying to protect them. If you have, I think older players, you definitely need to consider if they get hamstring injuries. This is something you have to take very, very seriously. And I mean, you always have to take it, and the serious injury you have to take very, very seriously. I think this hamstring injuries can ruin players' careers. I think for a slow player like you and me, it's probably not as detrimental. I think for me, it took me a long time to get over. I had a nasty one, but it was not. I mean, if I'd been a very fast player, I think it would have been a much bigger problem for me. And that's the other thing, is when you work with a sprinter, that's so interesting, because a sprinter would tell you all day long if they're not up, if their performance is not there. I mean, they can tell you that and they can even feel it in the sprint. So for a sprinter, they can see it on the sprinting times, all the performance stuff they did, it just comes up there. So usually they take a lot longer, because they feel the performance deficit straight away, or they can see it in the meshes they do. Whereas in football, you can hide, like in the defensive midfield where we were playing, in practice, it's very, very easy to hide with a hamstring injury. If you play even small-sided games as well, it's usually you can return very quickly, and you can hide that injury and play really well. The problem is when you then play on Sunday and you come in and the coach puts you on the wing or exactly right back, and you have to sprint back and forth, and then you're in trouble.
When you mentioned age and the fact that over 22, 23, you're in the old group, is that based on just general deterioration of cross-sectional area? What is it?
Yeah, that's again one of the questions that would be really interesting to dig into. We just published recently a study from in a collaboration with some Catalonian researchers in Spain. And again, this was sub-elite level. So again, they have other issues, especially, and they get a lot older, a lot of the players as well. But the level is pretty high in Spain, even at the next level. That would be Danish level still. But what we saw there was actually that age was really related to your eccentric strength as well. So it actually diminished almost like I think it was around 1% in relation to 1 year older you get. And we had an age range from 16 to almost 40 years old. So we had a big range, which was very interesting. So there might be something which is physiological, something happening to your structure. I think that would be very early if that already happens at 22 or 21. So there might be other issues at stake there, and again, would be very interesting to look into. I keep saying I have a feeling that in football or soccer or whatever these football codes are running sports, I think that's probably, where you peak from a performance perspective. If you have to do a lot of repetitive fast running, usually that's done really well by your 21-year-old, 22-year-old, 23-year-old player, and usually that's also that time where they have become good enough, experienced enough to make the team. You also see teams who want to play really, really aggressively, have a lot of sort of high intense running. They need younger players in the squad to sort of maintain that kind of tactics. So my guess would be that also is a massive load on your hamstrings. So not only how football have developed, but also your role in the team at that age could be massive. But something we have no data on. We've looked. We have some interesting data coming out. I'm not gonna steal his thunder, but Lasse Ishaj, who's done a lot of work at the highest level. But I think the short story is that it looks like where your quadricep strength just keeps continuing when you get older as a player. Your hamstring sort of doesn't when you turn into a senior player. It seems to actually just flatline a little bit.
Okay.
So that could be an interesting one because it might be at that age as well. So again, it might be that you have to be very aware of the fact that not only are you sort of putting a lot of load on these players, maybe just football training in itself is also not very hamstring stimulating. We work with hamstring and groin. I usually say that football and soccer can be very hard on your groin and your adductors and your hamstrings, but it's usually to the point where you're probably beating these structures a little bit, probably, and that usually also can cause some weakness. If you're really hard on structures, you usually see sort of sub conditions where you actually decrease your strength levels a little bit. So that could also maybe be an explanation why these young players, if they've been worked really hard, might have some sub conditions or sub states where they're actually decreasing their hamstring capacity. So it might be very important. And again, this is where measuring them could be really relevant. Are they dropping off during the season?
Yeah.
This refers back to Martin Volin's work. He's done that both on hamstrings. He's from Australia, worked at the academy, the AIS, and actually shown that in academy level you can implement these strength measures and you use it for early detection of players who are actually dropping off in eccentric hamstring strength, for instance, or that I think that was isometric, but still just the idea that you're testing hamstring capacity. So I think that could be hugely important, and maybe even screening for that is more important than establishing that one-off number that you were talking about.
Okay.
And also being willing to sort of manage players who are not necessarily injured but show signs of early hamstring weakness, hamstring injury, hamstring soreness. Tightness is another one. Players, athletes often complain of tightness. Maybe that's something you need to consider because it could be an early indication of being overworked.
You mentioned isometrics there, Kristian. Where do they fit in this whole picture?
So in Martin's study, I was not referring to it correctly. So in Martin's study, I think for testing sometimes, again, it's just, I think isometrics can sometimes be more acceptable in that setting, but in relation to hamstring injuries, I would actually prefer an eccentric measure. Okay. It's more stressful. I think you would pick up a deficit more easily, but he had them lengthened over the hip, which again, so he brought the hamstring into more length and in a position where he was also able to actually pick up some of these deficits in a very, I would say, in a position where you're not inducing any delayed onset muscle soreness as well. So from that perspective, it was a good test, I think. But cool. I think probably eccentric testing, I would guess it's a little bit more sensitive also to when you start to drop off a little bit.
Okay.
So it could be the non-board as well.
Yeah. Okay. So a couple more things just before I let you go.
Yeah.
Optimizing function post hamstring injury. Obviously, ideally they don't, but if they do, how can we work with them to optimize that to prevent a re-injury? Yeah.
So again, I think so. This is what is, I think, huge disagreements on Twitter as always, and whenever there's a study, people will say, "Oh, but that doesn't fit my practice or bias or whatever." And I think, and I agree, because that so the issue is often that I think one of the biggest where the disagreements are the biggest is when you have a club setting and you have like a clinical setting, which is where I work. So if you're in a club and you have somebody coming back from injury with a hamstring injury, I would say this is very, very difficult to manage actually, and to predict what's going to happen. And I think most people working in a club would agree with me that it's one of those things where they sometimes just close their eyes and pray and hope that this goes well. Yeah. And I think one of the reasons for that is because in clubs and in football, we're pushing the envelope all the time. So, and this is also, I think, actually a lot of work seems to suggest that yeah, everyone says that a hamstring injury takes 3 weeks, and sometimes you can even do it faster than that. But I think there's a lot of hamstring injuries that are not biologically healed at that point. Still, we're pushing them out there, and especially in football, they will also, a lot of them will manage and won't re-injure. So there's a good old paper from John Orchard where he's talking about sort of risk-reward ratios and saying, well, even if we do push them out a little bit early, the re-injury rate is such and such that I'm willing to take a few re-injuries, because if I have to sort of completely diminish the risk, then I have to wait so long that there's no player availability for the team to lose. So I think that's a really, really valid point, especially from a team perspective. The problem though is that then it becomes a little bit more sort of, it's very, very difficult to know when you have that hamstring injury that you probably should have hold on to a little bit longer. In the clinic, I can hold on to them usually for as long as I can, and I do. I usually tell them that the longer we can hold on to you, the better. And so unless they come, and they usually don't come to me if they don't have a big problem. Usually it's a re-injury sometimes. So they haven't managed in their clubs, and then I get them. Okay. So it's a different situation. They're not in a rush. Now they just want to get rid of the problem, really. So I think it's not fair on clubs to just say you're doing a real bad job, because their situation is completely different. On the other hand, I think this also contributes to the fact that we're not really changing the hamstring injury or the re-injury occurrence as well, or the percentages even, because we are pushing the envelope. I think it was Arsene Wenger who said nothing has happened in hamstring injury treatment because it still takes 3 weeks in some ways, and it was the same in the 50s, and it's the same now. And in some ways he's right, but I also think that nothing has changed in the way that we still try to push them out there when they're not actually probably completely healed, and so that sometimes it won't work. So what's interesting, if I may go back to the big RCT we did, was that, and I think again this is a point to why or proof I think of that people don't heal completely, and we know that from MRI, we know it from testing as well, is that usually there's a deficit that can stay there for a long time even after they've returned as well. But also when we did, so the Nordic hamstring injury prevention protocol was really, really effective for those with a history of a previous history of hamstring injury in the previous season. So basically 85% of those doing the Nordic, I mean, we could reduce the risk of 85% in those. So that was massive. It was even better than just preventing it overall. And that to me suggests that even if you target those players in the season after they had their previous injury, you're probably still in some ways rehabilitating them. So even though they came into a preventive study, you're probably still fixing some of these structural and also neuromuscular deficits that are still there, would be my guess. And the second point I have to back that up with was again this Spanish study, which was from Jordi Vicens from Catalonia, is that if we looked at those who had in the same season, but the season, so we did the Nordboard testing in the preseason, but when we looked at those who had an injury for more than 3 weeks in the previous season, they were the one who were weak in the Nordboard. So they were, again, I think it was plus 10, 12, 13% weaker than the rest. So if you just looked at previous history or not, we couldn't see a big difference. But if you looked at those who had an injury for more than 3 weeks, and I think that more than 3 weeks to me is suggesting that's sort of a little bit of a surrogate measure of a more severe injury. That's why they stay out of the game. They're not able to come back. So there would be some with a much more severe injury that would still carry this deficit in the beginning of the new season. So again, a very simple way to screen your players is also to ask them not just about did you have a hamstring injury in the previous season, also for how long did it actually keep you out. I think those who've been out for a long time, you really have to make sure that they have ongoing management, even when they say they're fine.
Cool. Well,
so I would say that it's definitely not a 3-week injury. You're looking more at something that you, especially for those severe ones, and you're probably looking at something you need to address for the next season and keep addressing. And I've had one of those injuries, so I'm biased. It took me, I think. So one thing was how long did it take to return? I don't know how yours was, but one thing was it took a long time to return. But then after I was returned, I was a physio at the time, so I was probably too aware of my injury as well. But I could feel that I was not feeling normal even when I was sprinting. If I had the long sprint, I could still feel that it just felt different. I was apprehensive, which also been shown in a few hamstring studies that apprehension is something you have to look out for, even in testing, but I think also in running. So ask your players about if they're feeling a little bit apprehensive. Be very careful if they come up with that, because I think that's your hamstring telling you this is where I would go. If you push me over this line, then I'll probably go again. And then try to tell that to a footballer. That's very different. I think they'll look at you and say, what are you on about? What do you mean? My hamstrings can't talk.
So Kristian, I said I'd keep you under an hour, so I'll try my best to do that. But what new research is coming out from your group? What interests are taking you forward? And then where can people get access to your work that we've spoken about?
Yeah, so I think definitely what have focused a lot on, not talk so much about today, is definitely now we've gone a little bit more into the performance stuff, and I can do that very shortly. So again, that's Lasse and Ishai and also Kasper Krummes from our department. They've done 2 RCTs, a pilot one, but also a larger RCT, where they actually. So the aim was actually to look at whether Nordics, because they had a really bad rep. So are they actually detrimental also for hamstring? Are they actually increasing the risk of getting an injury? Can you get injured during this kind of training, or not necessarily during the exercise, but in the period that you're doing it? So we were actually, and also some said they decrease your performance. So maybe it doesn't increase your injury rate, but at least they decrease your performance. So we looked a lot on performance, and this was one of those moments where, in our heads, at least in my head, I was completely biased towards the long sprint as well. I thought, if this changes anything in performance, it should show up on the 30-meter sprint maybe. And what we saw in the pilot study by Kasper was the opposite. Was looked very effective on the 5-meter and the 10-meter sprint, and which was a surprise to us in the beginning. So again, we've looked further into this and tried also. So looking very much into what they're doing in France, JB Morin's work on acceleration and horizontal and vertical forces and stuff like that. And what it looks to from our side anyway is that it looks as if Nordic hamstring, or that kind of a stimuli which is that aggressive on the hamstring eccentrically, looks to have a very good response in relation to rate of force development. So that's something we're working on at the moment that will come out shortly. We're in process with that. So some of the performance explanations could be, because again, you're doing an exercise that you would argue that looks a bit slow in relation to sprinting, but actually the muscle activation is very, very fast, and so the RFD actually seems to go up with this kind of exercise. We can see that's also when we use EMG, and we can see that over time also rate of force development increases in those who do Nordics. So I think this is very interesting for us also to try and understand. We had no idea that this would be so effective on the short sprints, at least at the sub-elite level where we have used it. Whether that is as easy at the professional level, I'm not sure. I think that's probably not true, but at least we can say it doesn't look to be hampering performance from what we can see. So this is something where we're going. I would love to look more into dosage, and I think I would much rather if we could do a trial where we're implementing a dosage that elite would also consider to be feasible. I think that would be interesting. The difficult part was that in my world, you have to put that up against the gold standard, and the gold standard is a 10-week protocol. So even that might be difficult to get the elite to do the gold standard. So again, we might have to drop to the sub-elite level, but I would like to see if we can get. And then the other challenge in research is if you want to show that something is just of a similar effect, what we call equivalence, you need a lot of participants. So even though a lot of studies claim this was just as effective, usually what they're showing is no difference, and that one is not superior than the other. So this is one of the challenges. But I would love to go into dosage and on the numbers of injuries, not just whether it actually affects a surrogate measure. So we will see if somebody's up for it. I'm happy to contribute. Everyone says that's up to us to do. This can only be done in Scandinavia, they say. I think, I'm not sure. I don't understand that argument. I think lots of nice RCTs are done in many places in the world. So why not?
Absolutely. And where can people get your work, Kristian? And I know you're quite active on Twitter, putting things out and having discussions.
So my Twitter profile, definitely. I'm on ResearchGate. We're trying to. All the open access stuff should be on there, and so that's probably the two main sources, I would say. I'm on LinkedIn as well, but yeah, probably ResearchGate and Twitter. We can put the addresses for that somewhere.
Of course, absolutely.
Yeah.
I'll make sure that happens.
Yeah,
fantastic. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. No. Thank you very much for giving up your time. I know it's. I've been pestering you for a while, so thank you for taking time in the diary. So I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thanks,
been
Kristian.
Ducking and diving.
Yes. No. Don't worry about that. You're a busy man. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Speak to you soon.